Hey guys, so I haven't been there for a little bit, so I figure I'd do a video lecture. What I really want to do, guys, is walk through that last like 150 pages of the book or so. Ideally, I wasn't there, so hopefully you walked through and looked at some of the sections that I highlighted. But I figure I would add this video as well. Let me like literally go through some of the highlighted sections the best I can. I'm gonna get pretty quick into it. So the first passage I really want to talk about, it's on page 213. It has to do with Mr. Bennet and Mr. Bennet's history. This particular passage, it's really right at the beginning of this chapter, again on page 213. And what the narrator allows us to know right here is actually the background of Mr. Bennet and why he married his wife and all of those elements. We've already seen their relationship. We've already seen that like they really have no interest in each other. The question is, why do they no longer have interest in each other? Is it because Mr. Bennet changed? Is it because Mrs. Bennet changed? Is it because has Mrs. Bennet always been in this way? Top of page 213. Had Elizabeth's opinion been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of congenial felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humour which youth and beauty generally give, have married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever. So, one of the things that Jane Austen does so beautifully in this passage is she sets up the beginning of the sentence with these very, very positive words: respect, esteem, confidence, and you're expecting something to happen, some kind of carryover to it. And then she immediately undermines that all of these things do not necessarily exist. They had vanished forever. She does the same exact thing with an earlier sentence too, where she says her father, captivated by youth and beauty. So again, starting with that positive beginning and then going into that negative turn, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in the marriage put an end to all real affection of her. Even when it says putting an end to something, it's putting an end to real affection. And this is something that Jane Austen does very, very common with the language of Pride and Prejudice. She uses these positive words and talks about how these positive things are coming to an end. She's not talking about characters being deteriorated. She's not talking about someone being a pile of garbage. Instead, she's talking about someone not being great. She's talking about, oh, well, look at that respect. Look at that cohesion in character. Look at that intelligence. Look at all those really good things that we value as a society, and they're gone. If I decided to use the same exact sentence structure to leave you essay feedback, it would ruin you forever. Janet, intelligence, sentence structure, vocabulary, cohesion of argument. These are all things that don't seem to exist in your paper or your mind or your grade anymore. So the next thing I really want to talk to you guys about, it's actually on the bottom of page 259. This has to do more with Mary. So Mary, which is Elizabeth's younger sister, she's right in the middle. She tends to say some interesting things in the beginning of the book, but she kind of doesn't really know how to think for herself. She knows how to play the piano, but she's very poor at it. Then all of a sudden, she actually says something pretty intelligent and pro-feminist right here. So the question I kind of have for you guys, and the question I want you to be considering as I'm reading this passage, is like, why is she in the novel at all? Why even bother with her existence? So, bottom of page 259. Unhappy as the event must be for Lydia, we must draw from it a useful lesson. The loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable. That one false step involves her in endless ruin. That reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too much guarded in her behaviour towards the undeserving of the other sex. Elizabeth lifted up her eyes in amazement, but was too much oppressed to make any reply. Mary, however, continued to console herself with such kind of moral extractions from the evil before them. So one of the most interesting things about this little passage that I just read, it's between 259 and 260, it's that juxtaposition between the quote itself and then immediately the description afterwards. when you look at Mary's words in isolation, it honestly does describe a lot of the feminist ideas that actually started to become much more popularized in the middle of the 1800s. In a way, some of those ideas are a little bit demeaning to women because it implies that any sort of sexuality or promiscuity also ruins women, which then puts women on a pedestal, and there's a huge problem with that. We'll talk about that more when we actually look at feminism throughout the 1800s. But the ideas themselves are actually like very common ideas that were stated in argument on something called the woman question, which is basically, what is woman's place in society? Everybody was trying to figure that out in the 1800s. The interesting thing, though, is immediately after that, you have the narrator, which the narrator has done this pretty much throughout the book, just silently undercut Mary's authority. And I mean silently because Mary's authority isn't being undercut in the situation. It's just happening as this interaction. It's almost like Austen is kind of letting us know what she really thinks and values these opinions. And the biggest thing that really stands out to me is the second sentence of that description from the narrator. Mary, however, continued to console herself with such kind of moral extractions from the evil before them. This idea that these people are just using intellectualism to escape the reality of the situation. They feel really good for themselves. And they say all these really great ideas that help themselves. They don't help anybody else. Let's actually move on to Elizabeth and let's move on to Darcy. So let's start off with Elizabeth herself. To be honest, as a character, Elizabeth is fine. For me, I really love Austen's Emma. I think Emma has a much more dramatic character arc. These last couple days I've been watching Toy Story, and like Woody's character arc throughout the 4 films is absolutely incredible. Elizabeth's character arc is just, I guess she has one. I don't know. She is a good character, and don't get me wrong about that, but her actual character development and the amount of change that she undergoes, it's not so much that she undergoes this fundamental change, is that she's put into these situations that really test her core and really test who she is. So as a result, there's not so much dynamic change, and she doesn't have this like kind of fluid up and down motion with these huge peaks and these huge high lows where like she really has to decide who she is. Instead, she kind of already seems like she knows who she is throughout the whole thing. And I think the biggest thing to really showcase this is we look at her relationship with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Now, Lady Catherine, when they first introduced her, she's very, very arrogant character, and she's still also an arrogant character on the pages I'm going to talk about now, which is actually page 323. So it's the very end of the book. Lady Catherine hasn't changed, but Elizabeth's relationship to Lady Catherine hasn't seemingly changed either. When Elizabeth first went to that dinner party, and we discussed this when I was in class, is, she was actually still pretty firm, still pretty stubborn. She was respectful, and she was civil, but it's not like she needed any additional courage to stand up. There are numerous passages talking about how she was ready up for the challenge for Lady Catherine. On page 323, everything kind of goes up to this boiling point. You have a really interesting interaction where Mr. Darcy is actually flipped into almost like a feminine gender role situation. So then he's actually put in the position where he's being told who he should marry. And you have this kind of feminizing of Darcy and this leveraging of political situation. You also have Lady Catherine, the grand financial figure in the novel, who also happens to be a woman. And she is also lecturing another woman on her position and place, not necessarily because she's a woman, because of her financial position in their class structure. So the passage I really want to focus on is at the very bottom of page 323. So Lady Catherine says,
"You are then resolved to have him." "I have said no such thing. I am only resolved to act in that manner which will, in my own opinion, constitute my happiness, without reserve to you, or to any person too wholly unconnected with me."
"It is well. You refuse then to oblige me. You refuse to obey the claims of duty, honor, gratitude. You are determined to ruin him in the opinion of all his friends, and make him the contempt of the world."
"Neither duty, nor honor, nor gratitude," replied Elizabeth. have any possible claim on me. In the present instance, no principle of either would be violated by my marriage with Mr. Darcy. And with regard to the resentment of his family, or the indignation of the world, if the former were excited by his marrying me, it would not give me one moment's concern, and the world in general would have too much sense to join in the scorn.
So I really like that passage, and I really wanted to kind of single it out to you guys, because we do have like a very, very clear quote where she is basically stating that she's interested in her own happiness. And this is something that's pretty revolutionary for female characters at the time, and something you shouldn't undervalue and shouldn't undercut when looking at Elizabeth's character. However, I do want to just kind of put one little chink into the armor of Elizabeth. I don't think she's changed much. There is an element of basically open-mindedness that has changed in terms of her valuing other people's characters and trying to understand more about what's going on in kind of these like social viperous environments. But for the most part, that's kind of what she's been doing throughout the whole entire book. There hasn't really been this really grand moment of disillusionment. And I want to bring it up again, like, this seems like something where if Lady Catherine confronted her the first time they met, she would have said it then. So there hasn't really been that material of a change since the first time that she's met Lady Catherine, and now the second time. Alright, so let's talk about Mr. Darcy and Liz. Alright, we're going to finish this off with a proposal. I promise to be as cheesy as possible with readings. You can skip them, it's a video. Yeah, but you're not going to. These are too good. These are too good. Middle of page 225. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced toward the party and spoke to Elizabeth, and not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. So I wanted to kind of start off with this passage to let you know that like Austen is kind of setting up all these little pieces that we know ahead of time their opinions of each other are being overturned. And this is actually a very, very kind novel, or very, very kind novel to the reader from Austen. Austen has been really mean to some of her readers, where she holds off until the last, 15 pages for something good to happen to the characters. I remember Emma was brutal like that. It's like you just keep reading. Please something good happen. Please something good happen. And then Persuasion is just like a nightmare sometimes. Anyways. But in this particular case, we actually know 100 pages ahead of time that things are actually starting to move in the right direction. The affection for both of them, even after that huge explosion of emotions, is starting to change. We know that things are getting better for the marriages themselves. And we start to just anticipate and build that tension for that second proposal. We know that that second proposal is going to be coming well ahead of time. The question is, when is it going to be coming? So let's actually take a really good look at that proposal. There's a lot of words in the proposal, but to be honest, this is the sixth time I'm starting to re-record this video. I don't really think I want to talk about much. The proposal is pretty clear. The big thing I do want to really emphasize is how heavily Darcy emphasizes that Elizabeth is the reason for his change. So in order to do this, let me read on page 334. So on page 334, it's that really, 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 really big paragraph. I cannot give you credit for any philosophy of the kind. Your retrospections must be so totally void of reproach that the contentment arising from them is not a philosophy, but which is much better, of innocence. But with me it is not so. Painful recollections will intrude which ought not to be repelled. I have been a selfish being all of my life. In practice, though not in principle. As a child I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, an only son for many years, an only child. I was spoilt by my parents who, though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable,
allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared to my own. Such I was from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. But you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased.
And this is huge. This is actually something that I haven't really been able to see done really well in the movies, and something that you don't really carry out, that can't be carried out because we don't really get a lot of Darcy's background. Darcy is very explicit, saying that his family raised him to basically be pretentious and to exclude himself from anyone that is of lower social classes. And in this moment, he's basically addressing and thanking Elizabeth for changing in him. And this is basically doing two very important things in the novel. First and foremost, Austen seems to be critiquing, at least on some level, the pretension of upper class families and how they basically restrict other people that are of worth from them. That all of a sudden, like, just because they're worth a lot of money, that therefore they are excluding everyone else. And it seems like an immediate commentary, and it seems like Austen is trying to suggest that the two can work together and benefit from each other. The second really important thing has to do with the relationships themselves. The idea that there has to be this give and take with the relationships, and that Darcy and Elizabeth actually do benefit from each other. There is something that both of them get. It's not just this one-sided thing where one person gets money and then the other person is a burden. Or it's not a one-sided affair where one person is really enjoyable and then the other person is not. So the idea that both people can contribute to each other, that they match each other, that they complement each other, and that they can benefit from each other and grow and become more virtuous, Austen is basically giving a moral lesson. And that morality and the morality of the novel is something very important to keep in mind. It was written in the early 1800s. And throughout the 1800s, you had this huge development on the idea of women's place in society and where women belong. And they just simplified it as the woman question. And Austen seems to be providing a relative answer fairly quickly here. But the answer is not something really crazy and revolutionary. It's not talking about throwing down the system. It's not even promoting divorce or anything like that. It's not promoting sexual freedom. Instead, her answer is basically saying codependency. That men need to realize that they have something to benefit from women, and women need to realize that they have a lot to benefit from men, provided that the two can benefit from each other. And that codependency has less to do with economics, though economics should be factored in, and has a lot more to do with virtue or qualities associated with virtue. Are they good people? Are they intelligent? Are they well-read? Are they kind? Are they open-minded? So that's it for Jane Austen. There's quite a lot of details that I just didn't have time to go over with you guys, or I'm just not going to put out a video because it'd be 9 hours long and it would take too long for me to make it. So what I'd like you guys to do with Pride and Prejudice at this point is just make sure the whole entire thing's just annotated. When I come back, I will check it. And the big thing for you that I really want you to carry over is I want you to start thinking about how you're going to use this novel and compare it and juxtapose it to some other novel that showcases the women's perspective. This perspective shows Austen's perspective. But what about Christina Rossetti's perspective? What about Mina Loy's perspective? What about, let's say, Jamaica Kincaid and Lucy? So there are a lot of perspectives, female perspectives in literature, and I want you to try to play around with how you're going to explore those things and which perspectives you think would be really interesting to compare and place next to each other. Thank you, guys.